The Sustainability Series is brought to you by BioCaf, the line of plant and mineral-based coffee equipment cleaners from Ernex. When it comes to sustainability, the choices we make every day have a huge impact on the world around us. And cleaning your cafe's equipment with BioCaf products is a simple step you can make to help the environment and create a more sustainable coffee industry. For the good of coffee, choose BioCaf. Find out more at biocaf.com. Hello, everybody. This is Chris DeFurio with Keys to the Shop, and welcome to the last episode in the Sustainability Series brought to you by BioCaf. Now, throughout this series, we have focused on the main links in the value chain. The cafe is traditionally where we say the chain ends. But what about the consumer? Without them, we wouldn't be here at all. After all, that's why we're taking such great pains to add value in hopes that it will be valuable enough to the consumer to regularly buy and thus sustain us as an industry. In this final episode, we're going to be exploring the role the consumer plays and what it takes to bring about more sustainability in the consumer market.
The supply chain is a circle. It's not A to B. It's a circle that starts with the consumer and really kind of ends with the consumer in a lot of ways. And I think we got to visualize it that way. And our supply chain, as consumers, we should understand that the supply chain is really only as strong as its weakest link.
Thalion Tremaine is the CEO and founder of Pachamama Coffee Cooperative, which is a vertically integrated cooperative that represents more than 240,000 smallholder coffee farmers around the world. It was launched in California in 2006, and Pachamama is the first coffee roaster in North America to be 100% owned and governed by farmers in Africa and Latin America. Thalion has led Pachamama's coffee formation and growth since 2003.
I think for most consumers, no. They don't necessarily see that there's any problem in the world of coffee. It seems pretty good. So I work for coffee farmers. I don't own Pachamama, and I answer to a board of directors that represents the 5 producer groups in Pachamama, which currently are groups in Peru, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico, and Ethiopia. When you look at any business, I suppose it's there for the benefit of the shareholders. And so, our business model is really, it's baked in to benefit farmers because they own the whole thing. So any profits generated, any equity created by Pachamama is owned by farmers.
I love that quote. I work for farmers. It's a brilliant statement that's not just a platitude, something you say on a competition stage, but an actual business reality supported by systems that not only give farmers more control, but also allows them to create connections with the consumers and the consuming market, which is an invaluable asset when we think about sustainability.
Farmers are helping themselves to become independent. And they're doing that by adding value to their coffee and negotiating directly with customers. So now they own that customer relationship. We've got accounts all over the country and hundreds of subscribers online who buy directly from Pachamama, buy directly from these farmers. And that gives them independence because they own that channel. But there are a lot of consumers that do care, and they're very loyal. And like I say, I think you just need to create a unique, authentic, genuine company and brand. And the market's big enough. We'll be a niche player. We're not going to take over the market or anything like that, but we don't need to either. We just create something powerful and very impactful, albeit small, but narrow and significant impact that is I think really economically sustainable because the farmers have the financial incentive to keep doing it. And then they have more financial incentive to continue to convert land towards organic and the like. And the consumer also has that same incentive, I think, as they learn more to be a participant.
So far, we have described the consumer in pretty general terms. It's critical, though, to get a little more specific on who is driving the market. Who are we marketing to?
Thoughts and behaviors on sustainability, I think, are really generationally driven.
Heather Ward is the SCA's Content Strategy Director and is responsible for providing leadership and vision in the development of virtual and in-person event content programs. Heather also advises on the SCA market research projects with the Coffee Science Foundation, and her previous role at the SCA was Market Research Manager, where she gathered, analyzed, and reported on coffee-related industry research, which focused on the specialty coffee consumer.
In the past 6 to 7 years, there's been a lot of media and business focus on this millennial generation, lots of buzz around that. And those are born between 1980 and 1994. And I remember 2014 and 15, that was like what we wanted to talk about when it came to consumers and their behaviors. What is this big cohort? They were enormous. They had there's a lot of people in this generation and huge buying power. So their behaviors and beliefs and views of the world were really important for businesses to pay attention to and understand. And they still are. We're still always talking about the next generation of consumers. So here we are in 2020, and this next generation has sort of crept up on us. This just Gen Z is what we call it. So those people born between 1995 and 2010. So really that's ages 10 to 25, the pretty young at the bottom side, but they're joining the workforce and there's a lot of research that's been coming out probably in the last year on this generation and what their behaviors are. What are they thinking? What are their views? And what's really interesting is they're anchored in one element, which is the generation's search for truth. So it gives them their nickname, which is Gen True. It's these younger generations that are sort of driving this as we move forward.
So how are they doing that? One of the ways things have shifted and continue to shift is more people are purchasing based on their values.
And they're making purchase decisions and relating to companies in a highly analytical and pragmatic way, whereas millennials were a little bit more idealistic. So they're believing intensely also in the value of discussion and dialogue to solve conflicts and improve the world. They're less confrontational as millennials. Millennials would want to debate. The Gen Z would like to discuss. So there's this value expression too, and acceptance among people in their individualities. There's an increased interest in anything that consumers are buying, of where it's coming from, if it's local, and who is making it.
More than traditional branding, we need a message, a story, a value that we are upholding. In the last episode, we heard Karen Lichtheig of Nosa Familia talk about the importance of marketing that message. And as we hear from Heather Ward now, consumers' purchases are based more on ethics and the perceived morals of the company they're purchasing from than ever before.
80% of Gen Z refuse to buy goods from companies involved in scandals or any unethical behavior. So it's when they're consuming, it's a matter of ethical concern. I always think about, where we are with the generations of consumers and who's demanding this and how we're talking to them, and how the marketing that it's shifting. It's not traditional marketing of a company just saying, having beautiful artistic branding, and there has to be a message now with that. And also there has to be, it's something that consumers need to align with or identify with. So they're valuing this company's ethics and morals. And that's really getting people on board with purchasing from them.
Ultimately, what we need to do is to be able to meet their practical needs and their desire to make a difference with their purchases.
The bulk of consumers are kind of weaving that balance through their lives and through their consumption choices. And they're kind of looking at balancing what they do for sustainability with what's in it for themselves.
That's Spencer M. Ross, PhD. Spencer is an assistant professor of marketing at University of Massachusetts Lowell's Manning School of Business. His dual research interests focus both on intersection of consumer marketing and society and on consumer engagement with digital marketing technologies. But Spencer primarily researches sustainable consumption behaviors, and he has published articles on consumer dispositions towards fairness in sustainable consumption. Here, Spencer is helping us break down even further who we're marketing to and exactly why it's important for us to assess our own behaviors in relation to the market, on top of knowing the behaviors of the market.
The cup of coffee is kind of the easiest way, an entry point for most consumers to get into some form of sustainability. And I think that's where specialty coffee has a lot of opportunity. Specialty coffee has been very oriented towards sustainability, towards collective interest, towards helping everybody through and up and down the value chain. I see a lot of value in sustainability in some of the upstream practices of the value chain as being beneficial to many consumers down here, and that there's a lot of market potential for people who are interested but don't know what to do. But from the downstream perspective, a lot of that doesn't end up getting captured. It doesn't end up getting communicated, and it's not always that the consumer wants it to be communicated directly to. They don't want to know all of this, how that sausage is being made. They want to know that what they're doing is going to be beneficial. And so a lot of the things that specialty coffee is doing is beneficial on kind of one part of that chain, and it's not necessarily getting out to the other part of the chain where it might help grow the market.
So by studying the values and needs of those that we're trying to reach, we stand a better chance at not just communicating value, but creating actual value along the value chain. Like Spencer points out, some of that is not getting captured, and this creates a value bottleneck and impacts everybody. And as Spencer explains, being sensitive to a particular group of people that we're trying to reach and connect with is not just based on their varying degrees of altruism, but also based on appealing to their individual tastes.
I mean, basic economics is supply and demand, and part of the supply and demand gets into the nuance of, what the behaviors of the consumers are, but what the behaviors includes is taste preferences. Part of it is market research and saying, okay, well, what do consumers want? And I know that there are some companies in the industry that have some decent data, fairly robust data on what consumers want, both in what they're purchasing, but also what they're saying in direct market research.
Now, all this can seem daunting. We can easily get the impression that consumers are just an unsolvable enigma, but as with most things we have discussed in this series, there is a large-scale approach and a smaller, more localized approach. And this helps us because we can study our localized business trends and serve our customers based on how they are voting with their dollars. We can market the message pretty easily and well in that context. Now, the trouble with this is that part of what makes sustainability impactful is the ability to scale. Managing the tension between a small company versus a large company and the skepticism that consumers have toward large businesses and their ethics.
Pew Research was saying that the path is more challenging for larger corporations than smaller because the respondents were saying that they believe that major brands are less ethical than smaller ones, which was interesting just to have that thought right off the bat. And that might be something challenging for companies and their branding. So for companies, I think this just means that they have to rethink how they deliver value to the consumer, rebalancing that mass production against personalization. So, and practice what they preach when they address issues is super important. Just knowing that they are working on something as well as far as a business goes, that's kind of like aligning with the business that you want to purchase from. It's like aligning their minds or their goals in regards to sustainability. So if consumers are doing that on their part, they want to expect the business will be doing the same thing. And they also want to see that.
So the key to all of this is communication. We want to send a clear message to the consumers of what we're about and how they can help. But there are some issues in this that we need to clarify in order for the consumer to be able to effectively latch onto and support what it is we are presenting to them. Our language can at times be confusing to consumers. So we're back to the way we kind of started this series, talking about a definition.
If you don't have an understanding of what specialty coffee is, what does that do for the consumer? And that's a problem. It's a problem because nobody then, if you ask your roaster or you ask your cafe or you ask the person that you're buying online what sustainability is and what does that mean about specialty coffee, I think that you would get myriad different responses, and that only serves to confuse consumers as to what specialty coffee is. And so as I see it, there needs to be a more top-down identity about what sustainability is and what specialty coffee is, and whether the two are separate or they're together, and if so, how and why. Having that tighter definition for both would end up being more beneficial to everybody down the chain, because then people would know what they're actually doing. So I don't think that it's necessarily wrong that the two are intertwined. They make sense that there is a correlation between the two. But then if there is going to be that correlation, then it has to be defined. It's people of value, it's processes of value, and it is products of value. And I think that's the thing that consumers need to understand. And areas where specialty coffee has the ability to define that. If you can define what people of value are, who people of value are, what products of value you're offering, and where this all comes from, then you have a really good kind of basis to take as an industry the value top down and provide that clarity in a way to the industry where that can ultimately be communicated to the consumer.
So the need to clarify the definition of specialty coffee and to speak with clear language on our end helps us know what to promote and why we're promoting it. And again, it helps the consumer latch onto it as well. But when we communicate with consumers, we're often failing to connect with them in meaningful ways. As a hospitality industry, how we welcome people into coffee in large part will determine their enthusiasm for coffee and our success in creating sustainability impact through that stable customer base. So what is it that we're missing here?
I realize that there's just a giant chasm between the amount of people that drink coffee and like coffee and have it be a daily ritual and us as an industry, and reaching them and making them feel welcome and like trying to actually pull them into our supply chain. And I don't think there's any malicious intent. I was just like looking at the numbers like, wow, there's a lot more coffee drinkers in the world than we have drinking our coffee.
Erica Voney is a consultant and curator with an extensive 15-year history in the specialty coffee industry, which includes quality control implementation, green buying, green selling, all the way to the world of tech and coffee subscriptions. She has a really deep knowledge with what's going on in the consumer market based on her experience. And here Erica breaks down for us the importance of how we present ourselves and the industry and how people can or cannot see themselves as a part of it. And the key, of course, is that consumers have to see themselves as a part of the industry with us.
Even though in specialty we are familiar with this vocab, we forget that we had to learn it. And people who just drink coffee every day, as a part of their daily life, don't have the vocab book. They don't, we were taught all of these words because we work in the industry. We're putting all this information on the bags without making the customers curious as to what it means and why it's important to us.
For Erica, our marketing is not only confusing, but additionally, it's alienating, causing us to miss out on winning over large segments of the population that, were it not for us being more gatekeepers than hosts to them, they'd be interested in what we're promoting.
Everyone is responsible for the marketing that's been put out there because we've all engaged in it. Specialty has not paved the way for a majority of the marketing. We just don't. We're a fractured market. We're not trying to alienate our customers or confuse them in any way, but it's just the way that it is. And we have to think of like unifying language that we can all use to reach our customers, to help them understand and to get them involved and interested.
Spencer M. Ross tells a story about the famed coffee roaster and icon George Howell that illustrates the right way to go about this process of welcoming people in.
When I listen to him and, the way they train their staff, certainly that is very much trying to educate consumers, but not hit them over the head, not to tell them that their taste preferences are wrong, but to do so in a way that kind of subtly educates the consumer in a way that the consumer subtly is willing to try and take that risk. The consumer ultimately has to figure out what that value is. We talk about value as really a ratio of benefits to costs. And when we look at those benefits to costs, what we're looking at is, from the consumer, what do they get out of this versus what are they putting into it? And what are they putting into it is typically the price that they're paying for their cup of coffee or their bag of coffee. Where some of the other industries look at this is where they say, okay, we have a lot of features and we have ways of communicating those features, and we're going to do so in a way that consumer knows exactly what they're getting, and how that either benefits the consumer as an individual and self-interest, or how it benefits the consumer and their ability to help collective interest. It is very much like that, I think, with specialty coffee, right? There are people who can otherwise create brands who are very much doing the same thing behind the scenes, maybe even doing more behind the scenes to benefit farmers, but they're not necessarily, throwing it over in the consumer's face, but they're actually trying to do those types of things, and they're building those strong brands, and they're communicating very lightly what they're doing sustainably, in hopes that if they create a strong brand, a brand that is meaningful, a brand that maybe has a certain aesthetic, that they're appealing for a certain type of consumer.
Now, how we represent coffees to consumers and educate them and welcome them in is not just important in countries traditionally accepted as consuming countries in the global north. At origin, the effort is just as important, as more and more cafes and roasters are opening in and serve their country's coffee to the local population.
So sometimes you have this, the best is always exported. And the locals, they don't drink that great stuff and that good of coffee. And there were very few shops. So we had a chance to open up a really cool shop in a cultural center.
That's Felipe Croce, son of Marcos Croce of FAF Brazil, who we heard from in the first episode of this series, on the farming episode. Felipe runs the farm at FAF, and among many things, spearheads the operation's innovations and organic efforts, and is very much connected to the wider world of specialty coffee, as he's had a lot of training in some of the world's best cafes and roasteries before taking the helm at FAF Brazil. Internal consumption is on the rise all over the world, and Brazil is no exception. Here, Felipe is describing how for a season at FAF, they ventured into the cafe scene in Brazil, and it really serves to highlight the relatively untapped consumer markets for coffee-growing countries that exist right in their own backyard.
It was about focus. So we can only serve Brazilian coffees in Brazil. And so we only focused on our range of coffees were smaller. So we explain, this coffee is from Celso, he's from Kakonji, and people are like, oh, my cousin's from Kakonji, I've been there. Where? Oh, well, the dam, you go past the dam, you take a right. He's like, I know where that is. So, the same exchange would go down in another, like in Australia or something. Hey, this is a Guatemala. And the person's like, cool. Like they can't understand what that means. Whenever you have an interaction with someone, you have to find some middle ground. Being able to serve Brazilian coffees to Brazilians, it made it really fun and made it a conversation, and people were very proud. When I moved back to Brazil in 2009, specialty coffee was less than 1% of consumption, far less than 1%. It was very, very, very hard to find. So, now speed forward to 2020, the internal consumption market is now 5% of the consuming market. And actually, when we started in 2015, we were talking about 18 million bags consumed. Now we're talking about 23 million bags, and we're talking about 5% of 23 million bags. So it's been considerable growth. So I think that we will only have a great coffee culture anywhere in the world when the product is really appreciated at its origin.
Hey, So, if you're listening to this episode, you're probably interested in making the coffee industry more sustainable. The BioCaf Sustainability Series from Ernex features articles and insights written by specialty coffee professionals that tackle a range of social, economic, and environmental topics that are centered around this theme. Visit biocaf.com to read these pieces and learn how you can contribute to a more sustainable and equitable future for coffee. As we've been talking about connection and communication with the consumer and really getting them to latch on to not just coffee, but our message through the coffee, part of what makes our industry sustainable is how much access we have to markets. And we've talked about how important that is for farmers to have access to the consumer markets. Thalion was talking about that earlier in this episode. FAF Brazil is doing that through their BobaLink project, connecting small farmers with the greater market. But it's not just important for farmers, but it's also something increasingly important for roasters and retailers. And today we have an unprecedented access to the global market from wherever we operate, no matter our size. This has been proven especially true in the time of COVID, as web stores have been invaluable in keeping some businesses open. So this scaling of access also means the ability to scale our impact and also to sustain our own businesses that no longer have to rely on only one source of income. I want to go back to Erica Voni as she discusses this a bit more, relaying how this global market access is now just par for the course for cafes and roasters.
So the difference between, being a small roaster trying to access a larger global market and finding a revenue stream that, boosts your business because you're sending your coffee out around the country or around the world doesn't necessarily mean that you lose focus to the community, because you're still there. The more of a name that you can get out there and more of just a revenue stream that you can just access. It's like part of your wholesale, essentially. When you are on one of these platforms or on these subscriptions, it's part of your workflow in roasting. You just you box it, you send it out, you get the money back. The more that you can pull in from like a global economy, you can pump that back into your community. Curiosity and amount of coffee available is a huge driver for consumers. Like, they just want it. They want every coffee at their fingertips. They want to like step into a place and be like, wow, there's a million coffees here and I'm going to find one just for me. Like, that is something that gets people really, really excited. If your community is getting coffees in from, subscription services and from outside cities and places, it still makes the customer more curious and they want to maybe talk to the barista about it, like walk in. This has happened to me when I was a barista, customers who are coffee dorks come in and they're like, oh, have you tried, so-and-so from so-and-so? And I'm like, yeah, dude, let's talk about it. And then point them to like the coffee that we have. It can create a bigger community, honestly, by connecting all of us.
So rather than being gatekeepers, we need to be hosts. We are agents of curiosity in a sense. And part of how we increase our market and create a more sustainable industry is by making sure that we're getting buy-in from these customers that we have such great access to. We need to effectively change their minds in order to change their habits and then to change the future. But how do we do that?
No one does anything unless they're curious about it. And I think one of the things that specialty has sort of tried to do, just inherent in the way that we speak to our customers, is saying that it's a stronger supply chain, that, buying our coffee makes it more sustainable. You're buying into a more sustainable supply chain. But unless you get people to care about it, they're not really going to that's not something that drives them to purchase. Consumer habits impact coffee sustainability in a lot of different ways. The first, most obvious one is takeaway cups. That's, something that specialty coffee has been trying to move people towards reusable takeaway cups instead of single-use cups. There's been plenty of studies about how much coffee waste or coffee cup waste there is. You can crunch the numbers and it's kind of staggering. I think specialty coffee really does have to kind of drop the extraction geek narrative. But by telling our customers that they're doing good work simply just by purchasing the coffee itself, I think is a narrative that we should start pushing. I mean, whether it's true or not is a completely other conversation as well. But if you can guarantee your supply line is actually giving back to the farmer, working on infrastructure, and you can tell a truthful story, I think there's a lot of power there. We're putting all this information on the bags without making the customers curious as to what it means and why it's important to us. We just say it's important and it's information that you should know, but we don't really give them the benefit of the doubt in any capacity of like whether they want to know, whether they understand. These are people that are just getting coffee. And then we throw this at them, like all of this information, and they're like, well, what do I do with this? I don't know. So it can be alienating because you're told, look at all this important information. This is information that's important to why the coffee matters. And the customers are like, I'm just trying to get a cup of coffee, man. I just want it to taste good. It's difficult to try to get people to change if they don't want to. And with all of the news of climate change, that like glaring apparent facts about it, telling customers like coffee is kind of going extinct if we don't change the ways that we do things, hasn't worked. Yelling at people and negativity never really makes a change. If you guide them along in a positive way, give them rewards, tell them that they're doing a good job, make it easy to buy a reusable cup and, take a couple cents off the order, like they will want to change.
Spencer adds to this the fact of social influence in helping guide people's decisions, habits, and how they buy into something.
There's research out there that looks at what other people are doing, what other norms, what other social influences there are in our lives, and ways that groups affect us. All of that has influence on individual consumers' sustainability behavior. When we look at habits, right? Habit formation. One of the things that I find intriguing and I think makes coffee such an easier vehicle for sustainable consumption study is because it is something that most people have on a regular basis, maybe on a daily basis. And being able to say, how can you subtly change habits is important.
So at a deep level, we're not only trying to change our habits, we're trying to change the habits of individuals, groups, and corporations. It's a big task. We have explored how welcoming people as individuals, being clear about our values and definitions are critical, but how do we create mass change across an industry? To explore that a little bit more, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sukhbir Sandhu. Dr. Sandhu is a senior lecturer in sustainability and ethics at the University of South Australia Business and a researcher with the Center for Workplace Excellence. Her research focuses on social and environmental sustainability issues that confront organizations and societies.
I've done an MBA and then I worked with a major multinational that makes soft drinks. And I could see the effects on both sides. I could see the effects that making soft drinks, drawing water from the aquifers has on the local community. I could also see the role that multinationals play, both to cause some of the challenges that we see in sustainability, but also how they can help communities and societies address those. So my PhD was what drives firms to be environmentally and socially responsible. And since then, I've been looking at a whole range of sustainability issues. Firms need to be economically sustainable. They need to be able to make profits. But they also, to do this in the long term, they need to be environmentally and socially responsible.
Dr. Sandhu co-authored the study Coffee on the Run, Cultural and Institutional Factors in Waste Behaviors. In the study, she and her co-authors uncovered the drivers for habit change, both regarding the individual and mass adoption, and all of this focused on the takeaway coffee cup.
Both my co-authors and I, we've got a number of research projects that look at various facets. One of my most cited papers, as an example to this point, is about do consumers care about sustainability? And our findings, and this is, it's kind of sad that this is one of my most cited papers. And I say sad because in that paper, we found that consumers at that point, this is a 2010 article, 10 years ago, that consumers, they express a willingness to support environment-friendly options in all the surveys that we do. But when it actually comes to buying behavior, they don't always back that up. But the coffee cup was a particularly rich context for us to explore, just because it's so ubiquitous. Why are we so willing to have this resource, a coffee cup? So this coffee cup, which uses up a lot of resources, paper, plastic, polyethylene lining, it comes with an inbuilt script of disposability. So you drink it once, and the resources in it might still be very valuable, but it's ready for the landfill, ready for the dump. So what is it about individuals, about institutions, that we're so ready to be throwing away coffee cups? Coffee cups is just one example of where the idea behind the public policy is that if we give people monetary incentives to do the right thing, so if as a consumer you bring in your reusable cup and buy coffee, and if you get a discount, it's a reward for doing the right thing, and this should motivate consumers. Our study found that monetary incentives do not work. In fact, they did not care about the monetary incentives, not about the 10 cents, not about the 50 cents, not about the dollar. And people who chose to take away the throwaway disposable cups, they weren't motivated by this incentive either. Research supports that. So we know from other studies done with blood donations, for example, that when we start paying people to donate blood donations actually fall. So consumers actually told us that it's not because of the discounts that they bring in their own reusable coffee cups. It's because it's the ones who they did it because it's the right thing to do.
Now, remember back to how Heather Ward told us about the values and incentives today's customers have. Doing the right thing comes from, first, a set of values that the customer brings that we then give them an opportunity to fulfill. So little by little, as we take Erica Voni's advice and create opportunities to connect with our customers, the message makes its way into common understanding. And just as Spencer mentions about social influence, these behaviors become a socially accepted thing, or quote unquote, the right thing to do. Dr. Sandhu continues and shares more on this, and then brings us back to some familiar territory from our interview with Karen Lichtig in Nosa Familia's success with the to-go cup upcharge.
It goes back to some seminal research on consumer behavior. When people do the right thing, it's often not because of monetary incentives. Kahneman and Tversky, who are brilliant behavioral economists, so they say that consumers and people in general are not gain-seeking. They're more loss-averse. And what I mean by that is people want to avoid losses. They're not necessarily gain seekers. So receiving monetary incentives, being given a discount for bringing in your reusable cup, does not motivate people. So if we start charging them for using a takeaway disposable cup, that might be a different story. I think it's very consistent with what I've described, that people are not motivated by discounts that they receive when they bring in their reusable coffee cups. They are, however, likely to be motivated when they face a surcharge. So in the cafes that we studied and we observed, City Council had also put up posters there about the number of cups going to landfill, the impact it was having on the environment, all these cues that are sensitizing people to the extent of this problem. They definitely helped raise awareness. So we actually found that strong environmental messaging is one of the most potent forces. So when we asked these people who were not motivated by discounts, so why are you willing to make all this effort when there is a lot of convenience in just grabbing a throwaway coffee cup and walking and throwing it away? One of the biggest drivers we found for the right behavior is strong environmental messaging that doesn't just focus on guilt, but also focuses on the contributions that people can make.
Now, getting customers to see that their habits and patronage are actually doing good work is key. Dr. Sandhu describes how the intensity of our message has a direct impact on how it is received.
So the government's a strong actor in this area. They have to step up and provide the right strong environmental messaging. Media is a big actor. So the number of people in our studies who told us that they were impacted by the War on Waste TV show was mind-blowing. We saw the War on Waste TV show and we just couldn't bring ourselves to throw away another coffee cup. We also found that mimetic effects, when you watch someone else do the right thing, that has a very strong influence on your own behavior. So social norms matter. So people told us, I go out for a coffee with my colleagues, and this person always brings their own reusable cup, and I will feel bad about it. So mimetic effect, social norms, we need to go beyond the consumer. We need to address the conditions around them. We need to make sure the cafes provide the right environment where people can make the right decisions. Media provides the right environmental messaging. Governments provide the right kind of regulatory environments which promote it. And of course, the role of social norms is when people watch others do the right thing, they feel motivated to do the right thing.
So far, we have assigned most of the responsibility for sustainability to businesses to create the changes we know are going to aid in the sustainability efforts. But there are more influencers needed to make all of this actually work.
So I think it's a multifaceted problem where all three actors, consumers, cafes, regulators, have a big role to play. Perhaps policymakers more so, but all three can shift the needle if they work together. Consumers are feeling the pinch, they can see the environmental effects of what they're doing, and businesses are just doing what they're best at, responding to a market need. And what I think would be the missing piece in the puzzle would be regulators, policymakers stepping in to further strengthen or amplify this aspect about giving people, businesses incentives to do that.
As someone who's deeply familiar with the state of sustainability today, Dr. Sandhu is still hopeful for the future, and what gives her the most hope comes from the coffee industry and how solutions-oriented we are.
The coffee industry, from our research, and especially in the whole supply chain, the cafes in particular, they give me a lot of hope. The cafe owners in particular, unlike, for example, big multinationals that we study elsewhere, they actually wanted to do the right thing. They actually wanted to be a part of the solution, not just a part of the problem. We find that one of the biggest drivers for change is what we call as institutional isomorphism. I know it sounds a mouthful. If I unpack it, what it means is that businesses are likely to mimic each other's behavior. And that's a very strong driver for change within any institutional field. And in this case, cafes. When a few cafes start doing the right thing, set up these associations such as the responsible cafes, it sets on a whole ripple-on effect where other cafes at some point will start to mimic those effects. My one suggestion to cafes will be to try and replicate some of these things, such as forming their own networks about how to promote sustainability within their local networks. Because whether we like it or not, organizations mimic each other, they mimic each other's response. And it's very likely that if a few cafes succeed in having a strong reputation, the mimetic behavior is going to set in.
I love this because if you look around, you can see the mimetic effect that we have on each other and how we do mimic each other's business practices and other things from afar. Our ability to make an impact depends on how connected we are. As we get inspired by each other and build on the work of those that have either gone before us or those who are working alongside of us. So the mimetic nature of our connected industry today can be harnessed to produce scalable change in the behaviors of individuals, corporations, and the governments that represent them. Sustainability on the farm, roastery, and cafe, and with the consumer is hinged on this connection, inspiration, and this positive forward iteration in business. But even as we talk about the need to change the consumer, the onus is actually on us. We are the ones who create demand through what we say and do.
I do think that it is specialty's responsibility, more so than the consumer, to make being sustainable easy and effective. We shouldn't be blame shifting. We shouldn't be telling the consumer that they're wrong in any capacity, really. Like, we created them. We did create the customer. We want them to participate in our supply chain. So to shame them for not having a reusable cup or not composting their grounds or for literally anything, shaming them for anything is is wrong. We want them. We want them here. And it's our prerogative to make it easy for them to be sustainable. We take the onus on because they're our customers that we created to make it easy for them to participate in a sustainable supply chain. Customer education through empathy is definitely one of the most sustainable ways to like snag a long-term customer for sure. It's also incredibly taxing and it is not easy. And it's hard to do when like the line is out the door and you're just trying to like push people through and get them the coffee to get them out the door. Caring and showing that you care about what the customer wants because you care about what the coffee is, I think is a really powerful thing that baristas can do, that coffee professionals can do in general.
A lot of this comes back to not just the message about coffee, but the coffee itself. Remember, we are in a people-focused business, and there are people behind every element of what we do, as we've seen throughout this entire series. Empathy is good, but how we conduct business and act on that empathy down to what is in the cup is really critical.
A majority of customers like coffee that tastes like coffee. And there's a really easy way to get that to them. And it's focusing on celebrating and really like getting hyped about the 80 to 85 points coffees in the scale. Like giving those coffees the value of like, yes, there is a customer who will pay money for this 82 because it's exactly what they want. So this 82 is like exactly what I want. There is value there. We need to start looking at the value, like the dollar value in that end of the point scale, because there are customers that want that. So if we start adding value or like honoring the value of those coffees and the consumers that want those coffees, we like kick the door wide open. We say, we've got the coffee for you that you want to the consumer. The consumer's happy. The coffee is purchased from the farmer. The farmer actually gets a higher premium on those coffees because, the relationship and we know what we're giving them. And it's a win-win. We've been so focused on quality and we just want the best. Like even the name of our industry, special, like we want the best of the best. And we forget that 80 and above is the best of the best. It is special. And there is inherent value in those coffees. Accepting these coffees in our supply chain and honoring them and loving the customers that love them as well can create a much more sustainable supply chain overall.
Now, as we've discussed having a lot of access to consumers these days, we have to remember that we also have a lot more access today to the farm, and that's been a good thing and a bad thing on a lot of levels. As we consider the future and how we use our connections, I want to come back to Felipe Croce over at FAF Brazil, as he describes the kind of dynamics that exist now in how we influence things on the farm level. As you'll hear, balance and deference is of huge importance.
In Brazil, sometimes you can find big farms that have all of the professionals in-house. In our case, we're a family farm-driven company. We work with small farmers, small and medium family farmers in Brazil. But we've grown our network to be able to have all of these experts in different areas attending to the different changes that we need to make. So we're very attuned to feedback and what people say, trying to understand what people's preferences are, what our preferences are, as opposed to just what's necessarily a fad or a trend, and guide our farmers in a more consistent direction and a more stable and consistent direction. Coffee nowadays has become a lot more than just the cup. In the best cases, the best stories, the roasters, much like a chef, as you know, they get involved in the farm, they get involved in the projects, and then they take on this whole other pride. That's what I think a lot of my roasters are starting to lean towards. Marketing basically accelerates the inevitable. If an idea is good, it's going to blow up. If it's not good, it's going to die sooner. And you see this with things that can be trends or things that are going to stick around for a while. I think it's how you use it and what you do with it, which is more on us as companies to be responsible. I get really upset when I see companies or people going to farming land, especially small farmers, and telling them to do this fermentation or that fermentation or this or that kind of picking, things that they don't do themselves when they don't have farms or they don't have that experience. And worse, even so, when they haven't put themselves in the responsibility of supporting this project and this test. And then these farmers, they go ahead and do these 400-hour fermentations or something and whatnot. And then they have no one to sell to. And then this considerable amount of their income has just lost its value, threefold. So I think that we need to be very respectful and of other people's businesses and livelihoods and how we give out this information. If not, we need to hold ourselves reliable to be supportive of this R&D. Different companies take a different stance on this. Some of them listen more to their customers than others. Some of the coffees that the customers have as favorites are different than what the roasters, the professionals, prefer. So some of our best selling coffees are a little bit more chocolatey, a little bit more sweet, lower acidity. They've become staples in some of my roaster clients and where a lot of the volume comes from. But it's not necessarily what the green buyer gets particularly excited about.
So it's clear that listening to both the needs of the farmer and of the market is the balance that we're constantly trying to strike. The future of our messaging needs to be based on values that are lived out and practiced. This generation of consumers wants to see the walk, not just the talk. And Felipe reiterates this important part of our messaging and values and how they drive change.
I would love to see companies be more vocal about their values and stick true. Make sure that you have very defined values. You speak them loud to your customers and you prove them. People are really listening. And I think that there are people coming up with great solutions, all kinds of solutions for cups, for straws. And you see this in all over the supply chain, things happening. So it's never been more important to be loud about what you believe in and then really believe in pushing people to choose differently when they consume. If you can be more precise about what your values are, it's easier for customers to support. There's some great examples out there. There are people pushing for price transparency, that are pushing to tell more stories. It's a multi-step thing, but I think transparency and developing trust in the roaster is definitely the first step. And I think that with sustainability, it's gaining a lot of momentum and people are questioning, they're looking for answers, they're trying to understand. There's still these massive distances between worlds, but I don't think I've ever seen so much interest in what's going on all over the world.
Again, there's a lot of hope in these words, like there was in the words of Dr. Sandhu and her study of our industry and how we mimic each other toward common goals. The interest that people have drives innovation to see those interests and values realized more fully for future generations. And this is something that also encourages Thalion Tremaine of Pachamama as it relates to technology and strengthening of these connections that we have, the impact the consumer can have at origin to build new kinds of companies and build trust.
I think technology is what offers great hope to a lot of farmers and consumers as well, because if you think about it, perhaps the biggest problem in the industry is that we don't give the consumer very many options to have great impact for farmers. How can a consumer really impact farmers? How can they get more direct connections to farmers? How can they get more money back to farmers? And it's technology and e-commerce and going direct to consumer. That's the opportunity there to really change the equation and create an alternative path. And then I think it could be a really positive feedback loop where, the more consumers are involved, the more excited they get. They're valuing the coffee more, they get more money back to farmers. And in turn, farmers are investing and producing better coffee and better content and better narratives and a better true story of success. The consumer wants a brand that they can trust. And that's what we're building with Pachamama. They don't necessarily just want access to certain farmers and so forth. They really want a brand. And we've seen over the last 10 years just how much value a brand can create in coffee. I actually think the future is today in that sense, that it's that narrative and the brands that carry those narratives that are most valuable. Makes sense to me that on some level, at some point in time, farmers are going to have their own brand and be able to build up stories around that and within that. I think it's very important now that the farmer has a mechanism by which they can begin to tell their own stories and direct their own marketing teams as to how to represent those stories. Bringing farmers into your company as true partners, as perhaps co-owners, will bring benefits to your company that you may not expect.
It might go without saying here, as we've heard from so many different people, but the importance of stories cannot be overstated. Not just telling or selling the stories, but letting the stories motivate us to take action in substantial and tangible ways where the beneficiaries of the success of the industry are not just those at the end of the supply chain. There's not just the cafes, but it's the farmers and everyone along the chain. Back to our main message about sustainability. It takes just seeing an opportunity and then taking a small step forward together.
So paying attention, and moving forward and not taking all of this as this is what I should do, but just maybe taking pieces and see what resonates. And if we do know that consumers come into the shop and it is visual, so they see little efforts like you just mentioned of maybe the extra bins or recycling, things like that. So those are, I feel like, pretty easy steps as far as showing that or showing this, that you're going towards that route of being more sustainable. But just moving through with, that willingness to also learn about sustainability through the supply chain, asking questions, being vulnerable. The effort of starting, I feel, and having a sense of empowerment and responsibility, but not beating yourself up over not making the change overnight. As we move forward, there's going to be this heightened consumer awareness in sustainable issues and demands, and we're already seeing that. And how to bridge that gap between the consumer and then upstream with the farmer is the challenge here.
So, at the end of the day, after all our conversations in this series around sustainability, how do we come together in a way that creates a more stable and thriving industry? All of us listening to this series occupy different roles in an industry separated by thousands of miles of land and ocean, cultures and language, but the one thing that binds us together is our dependency on coffee and on each other. As Erica Koss told us in the beginning, sustainability is about holding each other up. In each cup of coffee, there are hundreds, thousands of lives that are represented. How do we hold each other up with whatever influence and power we happen to have in our roles in coffee? Well, that starts with the stories inspiring us to understand who is behind the coffee. Then we learn what is needed through research. We learn about our impact and how we operate our business to be ecologically, economically, and socially responsible. And then we take the next step forward with the people as our motivation, knowing that large and small, consistent collective action done with empathy and a mind to continually iterate in a positive and equitable direction will create a more sustainable future for the people that make up all the facets of the industry we love. As we enter into the new year, we're looking to bring in resiliency, as the landscape of coffee has been shaken like never before. The vulnerability of our supply chain is a wake-up call to us all to lean into relationships and action on others' behalf. It's my hope that this series on sustainability inspires you to take action where you can and be dedicated to it over the long haul to see it bear fruit. Please go to biocaf.com and download the program guide for this series, and you can dive into learning more from the experts and organizations that we heard from through our time together in this series. I'm Chris DeFirio from Keys to the Shop. Thank you again for joining us in this exploration of sustainability, brought to you by BioCaf.